She spent real coin on our throwaways.
Come Thursday night. Bring your plate.
Before we begin, you should know what this story ends with. A line stretched from the door of a small kitchen all the way to the end of a dirt road. Men who had not taken their hats off indoors in years held them to their chests without being asked. Children pushed to the front, and their fathers let them. The smell of fried chicken seasoned in a way nobody in Sagebrush Flats had ever smelled before rolled through the street like something sacred. And at the center of it all stood a woman most of them had laughed at just 1 week before. Her name was Maybelle Wick. She had arrived with nothing but a travel bag, a rusted cast-iron skillet, and a crate of dying chickens that everyone else had thrown away. She had not come to prove anything. She had simply come to cook. If you're new to Whitethorn Stories, welcome. Every week, we bring you a new tale of women who were overlooked, underestimated, or simply forgotten. Women who turned what little they had into something the world wasn't ready for. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Maybelle Wick arrived in Sagebrush Flats on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks after her husband's funeral. She carried one travel bag, one cast-iron skillet wrapped in a flour sack, and the address of a small rental cabin at the edge of town that her cousin had arranged, a cousin who, it turned out, had already moved on before Maybelle arrived. The cabin was real, at least. Cold, drafty, with a window that didn't quite close but real. Maybelle was 44 years old. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured, with dark eyes that didn't miss much and hands that had never, in her adult life, been idle. Her husband had been a good man, but they had spent 20 years farming soil that refused to give back. When he passed, there was nothing left to stay for. She had come to Sagebrush Flats because it was cheaper than anywhere else, and because a woman without resources cannot afford the luxury of preference. On her second morning in town, she walked to the market square looking for work and for something to eat. The market was small, a dozen stalls, a dry goods store, a pen of livestock at the far end. That was where she heard them. Not clucking, exactly. More like struggling. In a crate shoved to the side of the livestock pen, half hidden behind a post, sat 14 chickens. Scraggly, dull-feathered, 2 of them with closed eyes and limp necks resting against the wire. A hand-lettered sign leaned against the crate, free or best offer. Nobody had taken them. Maybelle crouched down and looked at them for a long moment. A man behind her laughed short, dismissive. "Those are dying birds, ma'am. Not worth the feed to keep 'em alive." Maybelle didn't look up. "What are they worth right now?" she asked. "Right now? Nothing." She pulled her coin purse from her pocket. Counted out what was there. It wasn't much. It was, in fact, almost everything she had. She bought all 14. There was a reason Maybelle Wick bought dying chickens that other people wouldn't touch. She had been doing it since she was 9 years old. Her mother, a woman named Ruth who had fed a family of 7 on a sharecropper's parcel in Georgia, had taught her that the secret to a good table was not starting with the finest ingredients. "Most cooks wait for the best chicken," her mother used to say, working at the fire while Maybelle watched. "We learned to make the worst chicken taste like Sunday." It was not a boast. It was a skill, refined across 2 decades of scarcity. Her mother had a way with seasoning, not fancy, not store-bought but layered and patient. She knew how to draw the fat slowly, how to salt in stages, how long to rest before the cast iron was truly ready. She knew which birds had more flavor because they had lived harder. She had learned, and then she had taught. Maybelle had carried that knowledge the way other women carried a locket. Without weight. Without display. Always present. In the cabin that afternoon, she worked quietly. She assessed each bird, separated the ones that could recover from the ones that would not wait. She cleaned and cut with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. She built a fire in the yard when the small hearth inside proved too narrow for what she had in mind. She had exactly 1 skillet. She had flour, salt, and the herbs she had dried and packed from her old garden before leaving. She had water from the well. That was enough. By late afternoon, the smell had already started to drift. Caleb Whitmore owned 40 acres east of town and a small cattle operation that was neither flourishing nor failing. He was 44 years old, sharp-eyed, slow to speak, the kind of man who listened more than most people noticed. He had been at the market square that morning. He had seen the woman crouched by the crate. He had heard the man laugh. He had not laughed. He had watched the way she looked at the birds, not with pity, not with desperation, but with the calm appraisal of someone doing a calculation. Someone who saw something in what she was looking at that others had missed. That kind of look, in Caleb's experience, did not come from luck. He passed by the edge of her property that evening on his way back from the eastern pasture. He told himself it was the usual route. It was not quite the usual route. The smell reached him before he could see the cabin. He slowed his horse without deciding to. The yard was lit with firelight. The woman was working at a cast-iron skillet propped over an open fire, both arms moving with the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of someone entirely in their element. Her back was to him. She did not look up. He sat on his horse for a moment he had no good explanation for. Then he continued on toward home. He didn't say anything about it. There was nothing to say. He had simply stopped on a road and watched a stranger cook. But he thought about it that night, longer than was reasonable. On the third day, Rupert Gann came to her cabin door. He was the owner of Sagebrush Flats dry goods store, a tall, thin man in his late 50s with a fixed expression of mild disapproval that had become, over the years, simply his face. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who believed he understood the proper order of things, and that order did not typically include large women cooking in yards. He introduced himself. He noted that the smoke from her fire had been visible from the market square. "There are concerns," he said, "about the smell." Maybelle looked at him from the doorway. "What kind of concerns?" "Disturbance is the word being used." She did not argue. She asked, clearly and without emotion, whether there was an ordinance against outdoor cooking on one's own property. There was not. She thanked him for stopping by and closed the door. Rupert Gann stood on her porch for a moment, uncertain what had just happened. Then he walked back toward town. What he did not know, what he couldn't have known, was that Maybelle had been dealing with men like him her entire life. Men who arrived with concerns. Men whose concerns, when followed back to their source, always turned out to be about something other than what they named. Smoke. Smell. Disturbance. Never the real thing. She built the fire again the next morning. By the end of the first week, Maybelle had nursed 11 of the 14 birds back to reasonable health. The other 3 had provided something else. She had set a small table outside her cabin door the previous evening, just a board across 2 barrels with a cloth she had brought from her old home. On it, a covered wooden bowl, a towel, and a handwritten card that said simply, "Help yourself." She had not advertised it. She had not told anyone. She had simply set it there. By the time she rose the next morning, the bowl was empty. She did not know who had taken it. She did not need to. She filled it again. Word traveled, as it does in small towns, without a single announcement. By the third evening, there was a child standing at the end of her path. Then a woman she didn't recognize. Then an elderly man who stood far back, as though he hadn't decided yet whether to approach. Maybelle brought a plate to each of them without asking if they wanted it. None of them refused. She worked without fanfare, without asking for thanks, without keeping any kind of ledger of who owed her what. She cooked because she could, and because in every town she had ever known, there were people who were hungry in ways they could not name. She fed them. That was all. Caleb appeared at her door on a Thursday evening. He was not empty-handed. He had brought a small bundle of firewood split clean and stacked over his arm, and he held it without ceremony, the way a man brings wood when he has run out of other reasons to show up. "You've been burning through your supply," he said. Maybelle looked at him. She looked at the wood. "How do you know what I've been burning through?" A pause. "I can see the smoke from the east pasture." She considered this. "That's quite a distance," she said. "Yes," he said. It is. She stepped back from the door and let him set the wood down in the yard. She did not invite him in, but she handed him a plate before he could leave. He stood and ate in the yard, which was the most natural thing in the world and also, somehow, nothing like anything he had expected from the evening. They talked not long, not deeply, but honestly. He asked where she had learned to cook like this. She told him about her mother. He told her he hadn't tasted food that reminded him of something in a long time. He couldn't say what it reminded him of, exactly. Only that it did. He left when the light was fully gone. He brought wood again the following Thursday. She handed him a plate again. Neither of them mentioned the pattern. 2 weeks after Maybelle's arrival, Rupert Gann came back. This time, he was not alone. He brought 2 other men from the town council, men who wore the expression of people performing an official function they had not entirely agreed to. The concern this time was more specific. There were, Rupert explained, regulations about food being distributed to the public without a license. He used the word distributed carefully, which meant he had prepared it in advance. Maybelle listened to all of it. Then she pointed out, calmly, that she had not charged anyone for anything. That she had not advertised the service. That she had set a bowl outside her home and refilled it, which was, to her understanding, the same thing any household with a garden did when they had more tomatoes than they could use. Rupert said the situations were not comparable. Maybelle said she supposed they would have to disagree. The men left. But Maybelle understood what was happening. Rupert Gann was not concerned about licenses. He was concerned about something shifting in Sagebrush Flats that he had not sanctioned. Something that had nothing to do with him and yet was, somehow, changing the temperature of the town. People were stopping at each other's doors more. Children were playing in the road past sundown. The elderly man who had stood far back on the first night had been seen, more than once, sitting on the barrel beside her table. None of that had anything to do with Rupert Gann, and he could feel it. The following morning, Maybelle found that the firewood Caleb had brought her was gone. Not stolen, moved. Set against the far side of the fence, away from her yard. With it, a note she did not recognize had been placed on her door: cease outdoor cooking activity or face formal complaint to the county. It was unsigned. She stood on her porch and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. She went inside. She sat at the small table in the cabin. She had $3 and some cents to her name. She had no family in this territory. She had 11 chickens, a cast-iron skillet, and a recipe that her mother had died without writing down because it had never needed writing. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands. For a long time, she simply sat. This was the part of the story that doesn't get told, usually. The part that happens before the turning point, when the woman sits in a cold cabin and considers the full weight of her situation without flinching from it. Without dressing it up into something easier. Maybelle Wick was not naive. She had been underestimated for the entirety of her 44 years. She had survived a drought, a failed harvest, a husband's slow illness, a funeral with no mourners but herself. She had survived things that had no names. She was not going to be stopped by a man who had made a sign. She got up. She built the fire. What Rupert Gann had not counted on was the Thursday that followed. He came that evening with the same 2 council members intending to deliver the formal complaint in person. He arrived to find 37 people in Maybelle Wick's yard. They had come on their own. Without announcement, without invitation. Word had reached them through the same routes all important things travel in small towns, through the woman who had accepted a plate on the second night, and had told her sister, who had told her neighbor, who had told the men at the feed store. They had come because the food was extraordinary. But they had stayed and come back for something more. There was a widow who had not left her house in 6 weeks who was standing, that evening, talking to a man she had not spoken to since her husband's death. There was a family new to the territory who had not, until that night, been welcomed into anyone's circle. There were old feuds being quietly, wordlessly set aside over a shared plate. Maybelle stood at the fire and fed them all. Rupert Gann stopped at the edge of the yard. He had expected to find a nuisance. Instead, he found something that looked if he was being honest, which he tried to be like the closest thing to a community supper that Sagebrush Flats had seen in 15 years. Possibly longer. He stood at the edge. He did not deliver the complaint. He put it in his coat pocket and did not take it out again. The next morning, Rupert Gann came to Maybelle's door alone. He did not bring paperwork. He brought, and this cost him something, a bolt of good cloth from his store. He set it on the porch railing without explaining. "For a proper table covering," he said. "If you intend to keep doing this." Maybelle looked at the cloth. Then she looked at him. "Are you giving me permission, Mr. Gann?" He straightened slightly. "I'm noting," he said, "that what you're doing appears to be of benefit to the town." It was not an apology. But in Sagebrush Flats, among men of Rupert Gann's generation, it was as close as one came. Maybelle picked up the cloth. "I'll make use of it," she said. What happened after that was not dramatic. Real life rarely is. The formal complaint was never filed. Maybelle was approached, quietly, by the town's women's association about whether she might be willing to teach not for charity, but for fair compensation. She agreed. She also agreed to Caleb Whitmore's suggestion, made carefully, over firewood on a Thursday, that a proper outdoor hearth built on the south side of the cabin might be more efficient than the fire pit she had been using. He had built one before. He knew what he was doing. She told him she would think about it. She had already decided before he reached his horse. By June of 1884, Maybelle Wick had 11 chickens, a proper outdoor hearth, a teaching arrangement with the Women's Association, and a Thursday evening that had become, without any formal declaration, the weekly gathering of Sagebrush Flats. She had also, somewhere between the second and fifth firewood delivery, begun to understand that Caleb Whitmore was not a man who brought wood to people he didn't care about. She hadn't rushed that understanding. She was 44 years old, and she knew the difference between what a person deserves and what they settle for. She had spent enough of her life doing the latter. When he asked, simply and without theater, if she'd be willing to let him stay past the fire going out, she said yes. Not because she needed him. She had managed the most difficult months of her life without anyone's help. But because there is a difference between surviving alone and choosing someone to sit beside when the night is quiet and the work is done. Maybelle Wick had come to Sagebrush Flats with nothing but a skillet and 14 dying birds. She had fed a town. She had built something that would outlast the season. And she had done it all with the chickens that nobody else wanted. That, her mother would have said, was exactly the point. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear which part hit hardest. Subscribe to Whitethorn Stories, and we'll see you next week.